proposal. The complexity that they add to the system is unparalleled, all to secure a tax cut for people at the top. So here we are in the holiday season, and they're telling us, by the way, that if we just borrow this money, that everything's going to be fine. What did they say about borrowing when Bill Clinton was president? What did they say about borrowing when Barack Obama was president? They lecture us day in and day out in an unyielding manner, even though the economic performance of Clinton and Obama outweighed the two Republican presidents in between. So here's the game plan for the holiday season. On your credit card, you know what the holiday hangover is? People go out and use their credit cards and they figure out all year how to try to pay for it. It's going to take you more than 10 years to try to pay for this, all upon the spurious notion that they guarantee economic growth, as the president said, by the way, that's going to exceed 6%. 6%. They're telling us that the stock market's gone up because of them, even though it's gone up since March of 2009. They're telling us now that this is going to spur unparalleled economic growth, even though the economy's been growing for 88 straight months. All on the credit card for the American people. Mr. Speaker, this is the worst piece of legislation that's come from the House in the 29 years that I have served here, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Time's expired. The gentleman from Massachusetts' time has expired. The gentleman from Texas is recognized. House will come to order. The gentleman from Texas is recognized.
So, Mr. Speaker, yield myself the remaining balance time, and I say to my Democratic colleagues, worst bill in 29 years with Obamacare. Don't sell yourself short. So, today we have a choice to make. We can either stick with the status quo, we just heard it. We can take bold action to overhaul this broken tax code and restore hope and opportunity, prosperity to Americans. Our choice is clear, and we have made ours. We will vote to send this bill to President Trump's desk to get real tax reform done for the American people for the first time in 31 years. We will deliver for the American people. I encourage my colleagues to join me in support of this bill. With that, I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman yields back the balance of his time. All time for debate has expired. Pursuant to House Resolution 668, the previous question is ordered. The question is on the motion by the gentleman from Texas. All those in favor will say aye. Those opposed say no. The ayes have it. The motion is agreed to. Gentleman from Massachusetts.
Mr. Speaker, with that, I ask for the yeas and nays.
The yeas and nays are requested. Those favoring a vote by the yeas and nays will rise. A sufficient number having risen, the yeas and nays are ordered. Members will record their votes by electronic device. Pursuant to Clause 8 of Rule 20, this 15-minute vote on the motion to concur will be followed by a 5-minute vote on suspending the rules and passing H.R. 1159. This is a 15-minute vote.
On this vote, the yeas are 224 and the nays are 201. The motion is adopted. Without objection, the motion to reconsider is laid upon the table. The unfinished business is on the vote on the motion from the gentleman from Florida, Mr. Dunn, to suspend the rules and pass H.R. 1159 as amended, on which the yeas and nays are ordered. The clerk will report the title of the bill.
H.R. 1159, a bill to provide for continuing cooperation between the National Aeronautics and Space Administration and the Israel Space Agency and for other purposes.
The question is, will the House suspend the rules and pass the bill as amended? Members will record their votes by electronic device. This is a 5-minute vote.
yeas are 411, the nays are 0. 2/3 being in the affirmative, the rules are suspended, the bill is passed, and without objection, the motion to reconsider is laid on the table.
House will come to order. House will come to order. Members, if they could take their conversations to the back of the chamber or out of the chamber. For what purpose does the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Henserling, seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, pursuant to House Resolution 657, I call up H.R. 4015 and ask for its immediate consideration in the House.
The clerk will report the title of the bill.
Union Calendar number 333, H.R. 4015, a bill to improve the quality of proxy advisory firms for the protection of investors and the U.S. economy and in the public interest by fostering accountability, transparency, responsiveness, and competition in the proxy advisory firm industry.
Pursuant to the House Resolution 657, an amendment in the nature of a substitute consisting of the text of Rules of Committee, print 115-46, is adopted and the bill, as amended, is considered read. The bill, as amended, shall be debated for 1 hour, equally divided and controlled by the chair, ranking minority member of the Committee on Financial Services. The gentleman from Texas, Mr. Henseling, and the gentlewoman from California, Ms. Waters, will each control 30 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Henseling.
Mr. Speaker, I ask unanimous consent that all members may have 5 legislative days in which to revise and extend their remarks and submit extraneous materials on the bill under consideration.
Without objection.
Mr. Speaker, the House is not in order.
The gentleman is correct. The House is not in order. The House will be in order. Take your conversations off the floor. The gentleman is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I yield myself as much time as I may consume.
The gentleman is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I rise in strong support of H.R. 4015, the Corporate Governance Reform and Transparency Act of 2017. And I thank the sponsor of this legislation, my good friend Mr. Duffy of Wisconsin, the chairman of the Housing and Insurance Subcommittee of our committee, for offering this bill. Each year, Mr. Speaker, public companies hold shareholder meetings where shareholders vote for the company's directors and on other significant corporate actions that require shareholder approval. Mr. Speaker, the House is not in order.
The gentleman is correct. Ladies and gentlemen, the House is to be in order. Take your conversations off the floor. The gentleman is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, the Securities and Exchange Commission requires that before these annual shareholder meetings take place, public companies must provide shareholders with proxy statements that include all important facts about matters to be voted on at a shareholder meeting. Many shareholders and investment advisors rely on information provided by proxy advisory firms to guide their votes on these matters. H.R. 4015 would enhance transparency in the shareholder proxy system by requiring proxy advisory firms to register with the SEC, disclose potential conflicts of interest and codes of ethics, and make their methodologies public. Mr. Speaker, this is a pure disclosure bill. Nothing more, nothing less. Proxy firms play an outsized role in the U.S. economy in shaping corporate governance. They counsel pension plans, mutual funds, and other institutional investors about how to vote the shares of corporations that they own. With respect to institutional investors, Mr. Speaker, the share of institutional investor ownership was roughly 46% as recently as 1987, but today that figure is more than 75%. In other words, the volume of proxy votes for which investors are responsible has grown into the billions. In 2003, the SEC adopted a rule under the Investment Advisors Act that requires an investment advisor to vote in the best interest of their clients on proxies. A series of SEC no-action letters give the investment advisor a fundamental safe harbor from liability if they use a proxy advisor. As a result, institutional investors have increasingly relied on proxy advisory firms to help them decide how to vote their shares. However, regulators, market participants, and academic observers have highlighted potential conflicts of interest that are inherent in the business models and activities of proxy advisory firms. The committee, for example, is aware of numerous instances whereby the two largest proxy advisory firms have issued vote recommendations to shareholders that include errors, misstatements of facts, and incomplete analysis. For example, in one instance, a company reported that even though the total shareholder return the company actually had generated for its shareholders was 64%, the proxy advisory firm Glass Lewis erroneously reported this calculation to be 26%. Another company reported that ISS erroneously reported that the company's long-term cash awards will vest and pay out their maximum opportunity in the event of a change of control. Well, this was reported even though the company's plan had been amended and approved by the shareholders years earlier in a manner that would pay out at target upon change in control, and there are many other examples. Some proxy advisory firms' recommendations have been made without any contact to the public company at all, and then these same proxy advisory firms encourage companies to join their service in order to have the privilege to, quote, influence an advisory firm's recommendations. I suspect for many people this simply does not pass the smell test. An industrial company told its shareholders, Mr. Speaker, quote, ISS's negative recommendation was based on flawed analysis of our compensation programs that did not appropriately take into account the significant declines in our CEO's pay in 2015 or the performance-based nature of our annual and long-term incentive compensation programs. A pharmaceutical company responded to a proxy advisory firm's recommendations with this statement, quote, for the second year in a row, Glass Lewis did not include its full pay for performance analysis in this report. For shareholders who rely only on Glass Lewis materials to make voting decisions, there is no discussion of the company's industry-leading performance over this time period. Again, Mr. Speaker, there are many, many more examples like these. So another concern that many people have, Mr. Speaker, is that the two largest proxy advisory firms collectively make up 97% of the proxy advisory industry, 97%. This monopolization and the lack of transparency regarding proxy advisory firms means that the writings, analysis, reports, and voting recommendations of these two firms have a disproportionate effect on fundamental corporate transactions like mergers or acquisitions, the approval of corporate directors, and shareholder proposals. In other words, these two firms have a huge impact on our economy. The gentleman from Wisconsin, Mr. Duffy's bill, helps address these concerns by setting up a new regulatory regime for proxy advisory firms that looks out for the interest of investors, shareholders, by ensuring they receive complete information through the proxy process and can better vote in a manner consistent with shareholder interest, as opposed to the potential conflicted interest of a proxy firm. Mr. Duffy's bill also helps ensure that shareholders and their proxies have access to accurate information regarding companies by allowing companies to provide input on proxy recommendations. This is especially important for emerging growth companies that rely heavily on investors. A bad proxy recommendation in which emerging growth companies cannot refute the recommendation can be devastating to those emerging growth companies and thus have a harmful impact on our economy. In a letter to our committee, the Biotechnology Innovation Organization wrote, quote, "Small business innovators operate in a unique industry that values a strong relationship with investors, yet they are often held to standards that are not applicable to their company and forced to engage in proxy fights over issues that do not add value to shareholders." H.R. 4015 would provide for SEC oversight of proxy advisory firms, ensuring that they operate within appropriate boundaries and can be held accountable to regulators and the public, unquote. To be clear, Mr. Speaker, nothing in this bill permits companies to rewrite a proxy firm's report or force a proxy firm to change its recommendation based on feedback received from the company. In summary, H.R. 4015 will improve transparency in the proxy system and enhance shareholder access to information by ensuring that proxy advisory firms are registered with the SEC, disclose potential conflicts of interest and codes of ethics, and make publicly available their methodologies for forming proxy recommendations and analysis. For every member who believes in investor protection and supports a healthier economy, they should support H.R. 4015. I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman from Texas reserves. The gentlewoman from California is recognized.
I yield myself such time as I may consume.
The gentlewoman is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, H.R. 4015, the so-called Corporate Governance Reform and Transparency Act, would create an untested, inappropriate, and burdensome regulatory framework for proxy advisory firms, making it much more difficult for shareholders to obtain unbiased research used to make well-informed voting decisions about the companies they own. Institutional investors, like pension funds and mutual funds, typically invest money on behalf of hardworking Americans in a large number of public companies. In exchange for their investment, companies provide investors with shares of ownership and a say on important proposed changes to how the companies are run. These proposals may relate to who sits on the board of directors, how much executives are paid, environmental practices, employee minimum wage, and non-discrimination policies. Shareholders often hire independent researchers called proxy advisory firms to help inform their voting decisions on the many proposals they consider each year. H.R. 4015 contains numerous provisions that would undermine proxy advisory firms and the shareholders that rely on them for unbiased advice. First, H.R. 4015 would essentially fulfill the wishes of corporate management by regulating proxy advisory firms out of existence. The bill requires proxy advisory firms to register with the Securities and Exchange Commission and authorizes the SEC to deny applications on a whim. Additionally, H.R. 4015 would force proxy advisors to publicly disclose their internal proprietary research methodologies and voting policies, which firms invest time and money into developing. The bill would also require proxy advisors to hire a sort of compliant department dedicated entirely to the grievances of corporate management rather than the advisor's own shareholder clients. These burdensome requirements would deter new proxy advisors from entering the market and squeeze out smaller, cost-sensitive firms. As a result, shareholders would be faced with ever-increasing fees to obtain research from a shrinking universe of advisors. Second, H.R. 4015 would grant corporate management the right to review and weigh in on a proxy advisor's draft recommendations before the shareholder clients who pay for the recommendations get to see a final report. If management raises a complaint that the advisor disagrees with, the bill allows management to get the last word by publishing its dissenting opinion in the advisor's final report. In other words, the bill is the equivalent of requiring that a teacher clear a report card with a student before sending it to his or her parents. Finally, 4015 is unnecessary in light of existing federal securities laws. For example, some proxy advisors, such as the largest firm, Institutional Shareholder Services, are already registered and regulated as investment advisors under the Investment Advisors Act of 1940. As such, they already owe heightened obligations to their customers, must make regular, comprehensive disclosures to regulators and the public, and are subject to periodic compliance examinations, among other legal responsibilities. Additionally, the SEC has already provided guidance on due diligence and oversight relating to proxy advisors. H.R. 4015 would replace this well-understood guidance with a harmful and inappropriate regulatory regime that undermines investors' ability to simply exercise their shareholder rights. Tellingly, nothing in H.R. 4015 advances the bill's purported goals of, quote, fostering accountability, transparency, responsiveness, and competition in the proxy advisory firm industry. Shareholders hold corporations and their management accountable by casting well-informed votes on important issues of corporate governance, including issues of diversity. For example, a recent study by Ernst & Young found that corporate board diversity and gender pay equity were key themes in the 2017 proxy season. Specifically, Ernst & Young found that over half of the investors it interviewed included diversity as a board priority in 2017, and, quote, proposals asking boards to report on and increase their board diversity are among the top shareholder proposals submitted this year, quote unquote. H.R. 2015 would render these important accountability efforts ineffective, as the institutional shareholders driving governance changes would be less able to obtain the research needed to inform voting decisions. Now, I can imagine that Americans listening to this debate may get confused that Republicans who have been singularly focused on repealing important safeguards and protections for America's consumers and investors are now claiming that they are seeking to protect investors with these new rules. But Mr. Speaker, if this bill truly helped investors, why have so many from all over America written letters to Congress opposing H.R. 2015? To name a few, the bill's opponents include public pension funds and government officials from California, Colorado, Connecticut, Florida, Illinois, New York, Ohio, Oregon, and Washington. These investors joined a letter from Council of Institutional Investors stating that H.R. 4015, quote, would weaken corporate governance in the United States, undercut proxy advisory firms' ability to uphold their fiduciary obligation to their investor clients, and reorient any surviving firms to serve companies rather than investors, quote unquote. Proponents of effective corporate governance, including Americans for Financial Reform, Consumers Federation of America, Public Citizen, and Principles for Responsible Investment, have similarly written to oppose this bill. For example, the Consumer Federation of America wrote that H.R. 4015, quote, would empower companies to bully proxy advisory firms into dropping their objections to management proposals or watering down their recommendations, quote unquote. Private institutional investors also agree that 4015 would leave shareholders reliant on biased information tilted toward the interests of company management. Sound corporate governance requires shareholders to have access to impartial information when voting on key corporate issues. If our nation's investors who provide the capital for businesses to grow jobs and our economy are unable to hold corporations accountable, they will be increasingly reluctant to invest. H.R. 4015 would thereby hurt the very businesses it purports to assist. For these reasons, I urge my colleagues to join me in opposing H.R. 4015, and I reserve the balance of my time.
The lady from California reserves. The gentleman from Texas is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I yield myself 10 seconds just to say it's a historic day in America. Republicans deliver historic tax relief for working Americans and small businesses, and the ranking member has articulated concern over burdensome requirements. I look forward to working with her now on reducing the burdensome requirements of the Dodd-Frank Act. Now, Mr. Speaker, I'm pleased to yield 4 minutes to the gentleman from Michigan, Mr. Huizinga, the chairman of the Financial Services Subcommittee on Capital Markets.
The gentleman from Michigan is recognized.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. And as has been pointed out, each year public companies convene these shareholder meetings at which the company's shareholders vote for the company's directors and on other significant corporate actions that require shareholder approval. As part of this annual process, the Securities and Exchange Commission requires public companies to provide their shareholders with a proxy statement before those meetings. A proxy statement includes all important facts about the matters to be voted on at the meeting, including, for example, information on board of directors candidates, director compensation, executive compensation, related party transactions, securities ownership by management, and eligible shareholder proposals. The information contained in the statement must be filed with the SEC before soliciting a shareholder vote on the election of directors and the approval of these other corporate actions. Solicitations, whether by management or shareholders, must disclose all important facts about the issues on which the shareholders are being asked to vote. Institutional investors, including investment advisors to mutual funds and pension funds, typically hold shares in a large number of public companies. Each year, the investment advisors to these funds vote billions of shares on behalf of their clients on thousands of proxy ballot items. What you've heard about really was the theoretical way this is supposed to run. Unfortunately, that's not reality, and that's not what you're hearing from the other side. Because in 2003, the SEC adopted a rule under the Investment Advisors Act of 1940 requiring an investment advisor that exercises voting authority over its clients' proxies to adopt policies and procedures designed to ensure that the investment advisor votes those proxies in the best interests of their clients. Perfect. It's exactly what they should be doing. The SEC's release adopting the rule clarified that, quote, an advisor could demonstrate that the vote was not a product of conflict of interest if it voted client securities in accordance with the predetermined policy based upon the recommendations of an independent third party. Okay so far, but here's where we see the problem. As a result, institutional investors increase their reliance on these proxy advisor firms to help them decide how to vote their shares. In 2004, the SEC staff, without a commission vote, just the staff, issued 2 no-action letters effectively blessing the practice of investment advisors simply voting their recommendations provided by a proxy advisor, according to SEC Commissioner Dan Gallagher. Largely as a result of the SEC's regulation, proxy advisor firms now wield tremendous outside influence on the U.S. proxy system. Studies have shown that the 2 largest proxy advisor firms comprise of approximately 97% of all the proxy advisory industry and can control a significant percentage of share votes in corporate elections, which is sometimes as high as 40%. There have been numerous instances where these two firms have issued vote recommendations on publicly traded companies that include errors, misstatements of fact, and incomplete analysis. Additionally, some proxy advisory firms' recommendations have been made without any sort of communication or contact with the public company that they are actually reviewing. In fact, these same proxy advisors firms even encourage companies to join their service on the other side of the ledger in order to have the privilege to, quote, influence an advisory firm's recommendations. You heard from the ranking member about a teacher having to check with the student about what their grades are going to be as a student. Well, what this is, Mr. Speaker, this is the teacher shaking down the student for their lunch money and milk money to make sure that they're behaving. So let's talk about reality here. So regulators, market participants, and academic observers have highlighted potential conflicts of interest inherent to this business model and activities of these proxy firms. For example, proxy advisory firms may feel pressured by their largest clients, many of whom may be activist investors, to issue voting recommendations that reflect those clients' specific agendas, not the boards or the corporations. Additionally, proxy advisory firms often provide voting recommendations.
You're recognized for an additional minute.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Additionally, proxy advisory firms often provide voting recommendations to investment advisors on matters for which they also provide consulting services to public companies. Talk about, again, a conflict of interest. Some proxy advisory firms also rate or score these public companies on their governance structures, policies, practices, and they are trying to actually influence the corporate governance practices of these companies. Essentially, these proxy advisory firms have hijacked the proxy system by aligning themselves with activist shareholders who also might be their clients to push social and political initiatives rather than using shareholder votes to maximize shareholder value and increasing shareholder returns. Well, 4015 is to the rescue on this. It would foster greater accountability, competition, responsiveness, and most importantly of all, transparency. This legislation would ensure that voting recommendations at proxy advisory firms are, in fact, in the interests of long-term shareholders. And so let's not misunderstand. The role of these proxy advisory firms serves a very important place in our economy. However, these firms aren't immune to conflicts of interest. The good work of my friend Mr. Duffy on 4015 will improve that transparency.
Gentleman's time is expired.
And I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman from Texas reserves. The gentlewoman from California is recognized.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. It's not enough that my friends on the opposite side of the aisle just voted to give the biggest tax breaks to America's richest corporations. They're back here now supporting the control and the dominance of corporations over our investors who need protections. The difference between us and them, they're for deregulation of Dodd-Frank and protection for consumers to support however they can give it for the biggest corporations in America. I will now yield 3 minutes to the distinguished ranking member of the subcommittee on capital markets, securities, and investments, Ms. Maloney of New York.
The gentlewoman from New York is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I rise in support of investor protection and in opposition to H.R. 4015. Proxy advisors provide recommendations to institutional investors on how to vote on board of director elections, shareholder resolutions. Big institutional investors are shareholders at thousands of public companies, and they simply don't have time to carefully review every single 100-page proxy statement in detail, especially because most public companies hold their shareholders' meetings at about the same 3-month period. So institutional investors rely on proxy advisors for vote recommendations, which are often tailored to the investor's particular corporate governance preferences. They also rely on proxy firms for their data management on shareholder votes and corporate governance. This is healthy. Proxy advisors do actually have the time to carefully read all of the statements and proposals because they are professionals that are hired to do just that. I agree that the current regulatory system for proxy advisors is not perfect. 2 proxy advisory firms account for 97% of the market, ISS and Glass Lewis, but for some reason they're regulated differently. ISS is a registered investment advisor, while Glass Lewis is not. Surely this is not an ideal setup. So I'm open to the idea of a better and more consistent regulatory regime for proxy advisors. But there are several things in this bill that concern me deeply. I don't see why companies should have a statutory right to receive and comment on a proxy advisor's draft recommendations before they're sent to investors. Proxy advisors aren't federal agencies with a notice and comment for private companies. They're working for private companies that are providing a valuable service. This is not appropriate at all. Asset managers that use proxy advisors also tell me that they would find proxy advisors a lot less useful if the proxy firm had to give the company an opportunity to comment on their vote recommendations before sending them to the asset manager. And a new addition to the bill is very troubling. This would raise the possibility of proxy advisors being forced to send the clients the company's own complaints about the proxy advisor's recommendations, even if the complaint is completely untrue. This is totally inappropriate, and I would say plain wrong. So while I am sympathetic to the idea that a better and more consistent regulatory regime could be developed, I cannot support this bill, and I have good company here and would ask permission, unanimous consent, to place in the record a letter from the Comptroller of the State of New York, Comptroller DiNapoli, a statement from the AFL-CIO of the United States of America, a statement from the institutional investors, the Consumer Federation of America, and a statement by Glass Lewis. This is a troubling bill. I urge my colleagues to vote no on it. It's bad for safety and soundness and for good governance in this country.
The gentlewoman from California reserves. The gentleman from Texas is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I am pleased now to yield 3 minutes to our Republican committee whip, the gentleman from Arkansas, Mr. Hill.
The gentleman from Arkansas is recognized for 3 minutes.
I thank the Speaker. I thank the Chairman. I rise in support today of the Corporate Governance Reform and Transparency Act of 2017 and appreciate my good friend Sean Duffy's work on it. Over the past 3 decades, I've advocated for responsible shareholder activism and urged for corporate boards of directors to perform their responsibility of careful stewardship, particularly in the essential functions in evaluating corporate strategy, hiring able and working executive management, and, critically, capital allocation. For example, as Berkshire Hathaway CEO Warren Buffett recommends, corporate compensation committees must be composed of saber-toothed tigers, not house cats, in their work. Likewise, investors must take their responsibility to hold boards accountable for their irreplaceable role in maximizing returns for shareholders while executing a corporate strategy that balances shareholder returns with employees and customers. So the question is, how can investors effectively lower agency costs and actively meet this accountability mission? For 20 years, this has been a much discussed area by thoughtful experts. Like Buffett, ISS founder Robert Monks, Marty Lipton, Lawrence Cunningham, grad schools at UCLA, Stanford, Harvard, Yale, all researched this challenge. Organizations of institutional investors, corporate directors, all pro-offer best practices. And how do we best align these interests for this mission, but make conflicts of interest readily apparent? The role of proxy advisory firms in the U.S. economy has grown over the last 2 decades and is a major shaper of corporate governance. And it's of national importance. These firms counsel our pension plans, our mutual funds, other institutional investors, which are more and more in the market. 75% of the market compared to when Robert Monks started thinking about the idea in the late 1980s. Under the current system, 2 proxy advisory firms now have 97% of the market, Mr. Speaker. And this monopolization and the lack of transparency regarding their work means that their writing, analysis, reports, and vote recommendations of just these 2 firms have a disproportionate effect on the fundamental corporate transactions like mergers and acquisitions, the approval of corporate directors, and other shareholder proposals. Also, this has created more of a checklist mentality in the boardroom. Directors today need information, yes, but more importantly, they need wisdom. And the proxy advisory firms are driving people in boardrooms, in my view, to more of a checklist mentality, regulatory mentality, and less using their business judgment and wisdom to guide our public companies. Proxy advisory firms aren't immune to conflicts of interest.
I yield the gentleman an additional 30 seconds.
The gentleman is recognized for an additional 30 seconds.
Thank you. These conflicts are provided by providing additional recommendations to the very firms that they're rating. So, Mr. Speaker, we need balance in this arena. And I think Mr. Duffy's bill provides a step towards that balance, an improvement in transparency in the proxy system, thereby enhancing shareholder access to important investment information. I appreciate his work on it. I thank his work in our committee, and I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman from Texas
Thank
reserves. The gentlewoman from California is recognized.
I yield 3 minutes to the hardworking member of the Financial Services Committee, the gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Scott.
The gentleman from Georgia is recognized for 3 minutes.
Thank you very much, Ms. Waters. This is indeed a very, very important issue, Mr. Speaker. I come at this from one who have worked with my good friend, Mr. Duffy, on this issue. More than that, I voted with Mr. Duffy for this bill in committee. However, there is some troubling things about this bill that could do one very damaging thing. It could put many of these proxy firms out of business. And I want to take a moment to explain what the danger is in the bill that made me change my mind. And I chatted with Mr. Duffy about it. He understands it. This is not to shed any negative light on his objective, but it's what he's doing to get to that objective that disturbs me, and I think should disturb the people of this Congress and this country, and that is this. It could be summed up in basically 2 words: unilateral authority. That's what this bill provides to the Securities and Exchange Commission. Unilateral authority to set the requirements, first of all, for what it means to be a proxy firm. When you put unilateral authority into the hands of a regulatory agency, we know the damage that can be done. And I agree that there may be some things that need to be done. But these words, unilateral authority, would mean that the Securities and Exchange Commission could establish any number of hurdles for these proxy advisor firms to jump over in order to just stay in business. Unilateral authority to do such things as setting financial requirements. One would say nothing may be wrong with that, but other hurdles that the Securities and Exchange Commission could put up likely will be arbitrary, illogical, such as them setting requirements for how many employees a proxy firm should have. And Mr. Speaker, this is a step too far. And it's especially during a time in our country when federal regulators have used their powers to attack the American people at any and other level. May I have 30 seconds to continue this
grant to
point?
the gentleman an additional 30 seconds.
The gentleman's recognized for another 30 seconds. Let me give you an example how you can put too much regulatory authority into an agency. When HSS this year used their powers to attack women's health, that happened. Or when the Department of Justice use their powers to reverse community policing reformings at the Department of Justice. All I'm saying in this particular argument, Mr. Speaker, is Mr. Duffy is well intended, but this goes too far, and I urge my colleagues to reject and vote no on this bill.
The gentleman yields back. The gentlewoman from California reserves. The gentleman from Texas is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I'm very pleased to yield 4 minutes to the gentleman from North Carolina, Mr. Budd.
The gentleman from North Carolina is recognized for 4 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So I rise today in support of H.R. 4015, and I want to thank Chairman Duffy for his leadership on this bipartisan piece of legislation, which will improve our country's shareholder proxy system. Since the early 2000s, we've seen market share in the shareholder proxy system consolidate essentially into a duopoly, as 2 firms control 97% of the market. And so, under the current system, potential conflicts of interest abound. For example, proxy advisor firms that provide voting recommendations to advisors often provide consulting services to those same public companies. So wouldn't it make sense that they at least notify their shareholders of this potential conflict of interest? Well, right now, while the SEC has offered guidance on this problem, the proxy firm wouldn't be required to do so. We need to get this bill on the books just to address this problem. This bill is also timely because we've seen proxy firms align themselves with political causes, unions, and align themselves with interest groups that do not always represent their shareholders' best interest. And shareholders oftentimes aren't even aware of these conflicts. Again, reform is needed. And so it should go without saying, Mr. Speaker, that the 2 problems outlined above, they pose problems for the shareholder and for the average investor. We cannot continue to allow the securities laws and processes to be wrapped in a series or in a service of political agenda. We've dealt with this issue in the Financial Services Committee on a number of fronts with regard to disclosure of information that's being weaponized against public companies, from mining to conflict minerals. It's time to deal with a proxy issue today. The number of public companies has fallen in recent years. It was never easy to be public, to be subject to the financial markets, and the pressures that come from being accountable to your shareholders. This issue, the proxy issue, is part of a larger tapestry of challenges that public companies face. They are increasingly choosing not to play the game. They're getting capital from dark pools, they're getting capital from hedge funds, and they're just staying private. That puts investment opportunities in the hands of the 1%, and that leaves retail investors out in the cold. Mr. Speaker, my constituents and North Carolina shareholders are, from the part-time trader to the full-time trader, they deserve better than this. And luckily, this body can do something to address these problems, and that's where Chairman Duffy's bipartisan legislation comes into play. His bill will bring about much-needed accountability, competition, and most importantly, transparency in the proxy and advisory firm industry. And his bill also protects clients and their financial future from being influenced by activists and outside interest groups. His legislation accomplishes this by mandating that proxy advisory firms register with the SEC, disclose potential conflicts of interest to the shareholders, and make their methods for coming up with proxy recommendations available to the public. 2 proxy advisory firms should not have this much control of the marketplace and the power to disproportionately affect fundamental corporate transactions. This bill is a win for the consumer, a win for the free market, and should be a bipartisan priority for this body. A number of outside commentators have been clear that the proxy industry has gained a worrisome degree of authority over companies. In fact, Columbia Law professor Jeffrey Gordon said that the burden of annual voting would lead investors, particularly institutional investors, to farm out evaluation of most pay plans to a handful of proxy advisory firms who themselves will seek to economize on those very proxy review costs. There are a host of others who are saying these same things about the way things are today in proxy voting. Ultimately, the shareholder is the one who suffers. We should put a stop to it. Once again, I want to thank Chairman Duffy for leading the fight on this issue, and I urge adoption of his legislation. Mr. Speaker, I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. The gentleman from Texas reserves. The gentlewoman from California is recognized.
I yield 3 minutes to an invaluable member of the Financial Services Committee, the gentleman from Massachusetts, Mr. Capuano.
The gentleman from Massachusetts is recognized for 3 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the gentlelady for yielding. You know, this is one of those mundane issues that 95% of America doesn't understand. I didn't understand much about it a while back because I don't have any proxy advisors. I do have money in retirement funds, and I do get those 100-page documents in the mail saying we're having a proxy fight and you should read it in the smallest print possible, and I do what 95% of America does. When I get those, I throw them right in the trash. Now, that doesn't make me smart. It just means I can't read through that stuff. I can't understand what they're doing with my pension funds. I kind of have to go on faith that they're not sticking it to me. That's what most of us do, and most anybody listening to this, that's the only thing they have to do with this issue. So I went out and found out what is a proxy advisor. Here's what it is. The pension funds, not always, but mostly pension funds, that invest my pension money do it all across the board. Many of them are small, some of them are big. And when it comes time to reading those 100-page documents in the thousands of companies they are invested in, they go out and hire somebody to help them do it. A proxy advisor. They go through those documents through accountants and actuaries and give them advice. Not a demand, advice. Now, I don't know about you, I get advice from my lawyer on occasion. I get advice from my accountant on occasion. I get advice from my priest on occasion. And it's none of your damn business what advice they give me. Because 2 of them I'm paying and 1 of them loves me. When a person or an entity hires someone else to give them advice, it is no one else's business what that is. This bill says it is. It is now, would be, the business of the company about whom they are giving the advice. So why? I paid them. Why should I share that information with you? That's what a proxy advisor is. It's not some big swami sitting in the back sticking it to big corporations. It's a paid advisor. Now, we've heard all terrible things what these advisors do. Who do they work for? Well, they work for pension funds. Mostly pension funds, by the way, that are public pension funds, not all, that have the pension money of teachers, firefighters, police officers, trash collectors, water workers, all across this country. And then there are private pension funds that work for union members, the AFL-CIO, the bricklayers, the SEIU. That's who is doing most of this investing on behalf of little people like me who don't have the knowledge or the time to be able to go through 100 pages of really fine print, really detailed stuff to determine which person I should vote for on a board of a company I don't know much about. That's it.
Gentleman's recognized for an additional 30
seconds. Who
are
the worst of the people who hire these people? Well, it turns out the Dominican sisters hire a proxy advisor. Oh, they are put together for the very purpose of ripping the heart out of corporate America. Those Dominican sisters, they are evil investors. Let's not forget the Daughters of Charity. Oh, terrible, terrible people. They're so busy caring for the poorest people in the world that they take time out of that in order to find a way to stick it to the biggest corporate people in the country.
No, 30 seconds to the gentleman.
And yet, they use proxy advisors. Let me see. Who wants this bill? Every corporation in America. Why? They don't want you knowing what they're doing. Let's see. Whose side am I on? I think if I have a choice between being on the side of the biggest corporations in this country or being with the Dominican sisters, I'm choosing the Dominican sisters. They are doing God's work. They use and need proxy advisors. Leave them alone. Thank the gentlelady for yielding.
Gentleman's time has expired. Gentlelady from California reserves. Gentleman from Texas recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I yield myself 10 seconds just to say that if the gentleman is so busy he can't read a 100-page proxy statement, perhaps he could read a 20-page bill and he would realize that his comments have almost absolutely nothing to do with the bill whatsoever. I'm now pleased to yield 5 minutes to the gentleman from Wisconsin, Mr. Duffy, the sponsor of the legislation and the chairman of the Financial Services Subcommittee on Housing and Insurance.
Gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
I appreciate the gentleman for yielding the chair of Financial Services, Mr. Henscheling. I appreciate his leadership and stewardship on our committee. I'm going to get into the bill in a second, but I can't let the Dominican sister reference go. It's not the Dominican sisters who are using proxy advisors. It's the largest financial investors in the world that are using these advisors, which we're going to get into in a little bit. And if you want to talk about sisters, I'll talk about the little sisters of the poor who have been ravaged by Obamacare because they can't practice their faith, if you want to talk about sisters. We're not going to go there today. And we're in a situation where, my friends, if you listen to the debate, you might go, well, Republicans are asking for a little more regulation in the proxy advisory space, and Democrats miraculously are saying, we don't want any regulation. Well, our concern is that you've consolidated power in two companies that control 97% of the industry. And some have made the claim in the allegation that there might be political motivations behind both or at least one of these massive proxy advisory firms, because Glass Lewis is owned by the Ontario Teachers Pension Fund, and they might have a political agenda that might affect the recommendations that have a massive impact on American corporate governance. Maybe that could be the distinction between the two parties in today's debate. But we've covered this quite a bit, but I want to go into it again. The role of proxy advisory firms in the U.S. economy is incredibly important. It's important stuff. And these firms, they counsel pension plans and mutual funds and institutional investors on how to vote their shares. And no one's trying to get rid of proxy advisory firms. We think they're a good thing, but we think they should have a little bit of regulation and a little bit of oversight. I think it's troubling. When you look at the share of institutional ownership, in 1987, it was 46%. Today, that's grown to 75%, meaning that institutional investors control billions of shares. There was a recent study that was done by Stanford that says that asset managers with $100 billion or more under their control only make 10% of the decisions on these proxy issues, meaning they outsource 90% of the decisions to one of two firms, consolidating great power in these proxy advisory firms. This was pointed out before as well, but again, two firms, 97% of the market share, writings, analysis, reports, voting recommendations that affect the fundamentals of corporate governance, mergers, acquisitions, approval of corporate directors, and shareholder proposals. And what's of greatest concern is that these firms are not free of conflicts of interest. For example, in addition to providing recommendations to institutional investors about how to vote, proxy advisory firms may advise companies about corporate governance issues, rate companies on corporate governance, help companies improve those ratings, and advise proponents about how to frame a proposal to get the most votes. They're playing every side of the issue. They're getting every dollar from anybody who cares about the corporate governance space. They play everybody. And if you want access, you pay. I'm going to give you an example in just a little bit of one of the hundreds of letters that I've received on this issue. But before I do that, I think it's important to go, what are we asking for? What's the radical idea that we've brought to the floor today, which, by the way, had 6 Democrats support? Mr. Scott commented about his support as well, and I know he had an issue of the cost that this would have on proxy advisory firms, but the CBO, which I rarely quote, but they did a study on this and say the cost of proxy advisory firms of this bill is minimal, if anything. So I think his concern might be misplaced. But what are we asking to do here? We're asking for accountability. We're asking for transparency, responsiveness, and competition in the proxy advisory space. And by doing that, we'll improve corporate governance, and in the end, we're going to protect investors. Specifically, again, this bipartisan bill will ensure that proxy advisory firms are registered with the SEC. They'll disclose potential conflicts of interest. They'll maintain a code of ethics and make publicly available their methodologies for formulating their proxy recommendations.
Yield the gentleman an additional minute.
Gentleman's recognized.
I don't know what my friends across the aisle have with maintaining a code of ethics or disclosing potential conflicts of interest or instituting an ombudsman to resolve issues that might come up. This is common sense stuff. This is good governance. And I would encourage all of my friends across the aisle to join us. I want to read one part of a letter that I received that I think embodies what's going on in corporate America. This is from, I'm not going to give the name of the company, but it says, upon contacting ISS and seeking an explanation on one of their recommendations, we were told there was a firewall between the ISS recommendation group and the ISS group that deals with corporate matters. Ultimately, we were advised that if we were willing to join ISS, which includes payment of a relatively substantial amount of money, we could have input into the recommendations before they were made. So pay for the input. Meanwhile, during our latest discussions, we were again advised that we could avoid some issues by subscribing.
I yield the gentleman an additional minute.
Thank you. Subscribing to ISS corporate services and thereby having some input before such recommendations were published. Of course, such a subscription would entail big payouts. On the one hand, ISS makes wholly unsupported, unreasonable, and irrational recommendations regarding corporate elections without investigation, regulatory support, or even contact with a victim company. While on the other hand, seeking fees from the victim company for the privilege of influencing ISS's recommendation. So what you have here is you have the mafia on the streets. So lo and behold, your little shop on the street corner, it's burglarized at 10 o'clock one night. And at 8 o'clock in the morning, lo and behold, the thugs come in and go, you want to buy some insurance? You want to buy some protection? Pay up. We'll keep you safe. ISS, Glass Lewis, you pay up, and we can help you with your recommendation. We can help you with your ratings. This is thuggery. Let's have a little common sense oversight in this space. It's a good bill. And with that, my time is well expired, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Gentleman from Texas reserves. Gentlelady from California is recognized.
Thank you very much. The gentleman talked about what's happening in corporate America. They're dancing in the streets after that big tax cut that was just given by my friends on the opposite side of the aisle. And as to just a couple of companies, or too few companies that are doing the advising for these investors, it was just a week or so ago that my friends on the opposite side of the aisle came here representing one company, Berkshire Hathaway, where they were asking this Congress to allow them to charge higher interest rates on the most vulnerable people in our population. With the high interest rates and the terrible foreclosure practices all over this manufactured housing that Berkshire Hathaway is selling to these most vulnerable people in our society. I now yield 3 minutes to the distinguished ranking member of the Subcommittee on Oversight and Investigations, the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Green.
Gentleman is recognized for 3 minutes.
I thank the ranking member for the time. And I'd also like to note this, that the ranking member, the Honorable Maxine Waters, is often the sentinel on watch. She is the person who is there to protect investors. She's there to protect persons who might, but for her absence, be taken advantage of. So I'm honored to speak with her and to stand with her. I oppose this bill today because this bill epitomizes what I believe is a business model that allows corporate America to take advantage of investors. This business model is one that has been perpetrated and perpetuated by my colleagues on the other side. This business model is one that surfaced in 2008 when the credit rating agencies became captives of the businesses that were providing the instruments that were to be rated. They were catering to the businesses to the detriment of the investors. I believe this business model is the one that allowed the fiduciary rule to be compromised. The fiduciary rule simply said that if you are working on behalf of an investor, you can't put your interests ahead of the investor's interest. That rule was compromised by my colleagues on the other side. So today, they again come with another business model that will allow investors to be taken advantage of. Caveat emptor is going to apply in a way that it has never been seen before as it will relate to these investors. It's time for us to prevent the business model of allowing investors to be taken advantage of and present a business model that allows the investor to have the benefit of advice from the proxy. That's what we have currently. Let's not change the business model. Let's make sure that the investor is properly protected, and I will yield back the balance of my time.
Yields back. Gentlelady from California reserves. Gentleman from Texas is recognized.
Reserve.
Gentleman from Texas reserves. Gentlelady from California is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I now yield 3 minutes to the gentlewoman from Texas, Ms. Jackson Lee.
Gentlelady is recognized for 3
I thank
minutes.
the gentlelady from California, and it is certainly my pleasure to be on the side of the gentlelady from California. Every time we have gotten these fights to attack Dodd-Frank, she's been on the right side of the issue. So let me clearly, though my voice is a little raspy, speak on behalf of those, as my colleagues have spoken, about those of us who certainly have a degree of education and receive those long statements where there are big fights and the print is so small. I will tell you that the proxy advisors are representing not us, but those vulnerable pensioners who put everything they've ever had in that pot. And those advisors give those public pension funds the counsel and advice that is necessary. First of all, this bill is entirely impractical. Pension plans and other institutional investors often hold shares in thousands of public companies. The bill will require proxy advisor firms who provide voting recommendations to these shareholders to provide the management with more than 4,000 public companies with the opportunity to present detailed comments on the firm's draft recommendations before paying shareholders receive a final report. It also wants to burden them with all kinds of extra trinkets that they have to give information about. Unprecedented right to weigh in by the corporations on voting recommendations, executive compensation, non-discrimination policies. Again, the proxy advisors work with the public pension funds, and who are they? They are the coal miners, the bus drivers. They are, in fact, those teachers and firemen and policemen. They are Americans who depend upon their pensions. And the reason, Madam Ranking Member, that I wanted to stand on this floor today is just a few minutes ago, we again voted for this catastrophic tax bill. And I wanted to tie this to, as I heard my good friend from Texas jumping up and celebrating. I assume they will run to the White House when this bill is passed in one way or the other. But let me describe to you what I believe is the scenario on the tax bill. We all like cliffhanger movies, and cliffhanger movies always get the family together to be able to tell the story or to sit in the movie and look at the cliffhanger, because it is always the heroes that win on a cliffhanger. You're waiting for the hero to launch down and save everyone. Well, here's the Republican cliffhanger. It is this tax bill, and the cliffhanger is you going up a mountain, and as you go up the mountain, Here are the Republicans in this tax bill that is going to take away millions of dollars from Medicaid, and they're throwing over this cliff.
Additional 30 seconds.
Gentlelady is recognized for an additional 30 seconds.
Medicaid recipients, people with dementia, my good friend who has ALS in a wheelchair, thrown over the cliff. They're throwing over teachers. They're throwing over individuals who are believing them that they're going to get jobs, and they're getting no jobs. They're throwing over families, working class families, 86 million of them.
Thank you. All right, thank you.
Just as long as I can see the answer. He wasn't in after he left. Mikey. We've got a lot of reflection. Not completely. It's underneath the Bitcoin or whatever that is. Oh, it's a Bitcoin thing.
I have read most every stack in newspapers. This is the one about the people like picking out mortgages. No, this is this morning. Oh, I definitely didn't read it.
It's just amazing that that name is popping up. Small amounts of Bitcoin. They forgot that. And there's no way. The name. It's not like calling up Citibank. Well, no, Newcastle. I don't know how to get it back to normal. Well, it took us 2 days to get it back, to change it. So I'll probably have to go to that again. It just keeps topping up. But it's a good picture. Bruce. Take it off. I'm only gonna work. How about you? I'm saving some of the last week of January. Right. What? That's plastic. No, it didn't. We had a friend who drove down it.
Hey, so what's the tentative plan for 332?
Yeah, that's not much.
This will probably be good. So my house is fun. We get, some stuff from Schumann towards I'll talk about it. Probably some of that last time. Even if everyone's opening up the plane, I can address that. I have been asking you about that a little. There's one question. And also, if he wants to, about why the president will sign a bill, these pay-go provisions. He wants to talk about the tax bill itself. That's kind of the story of the hour. Those are the ways to deal house. But I'm happy to hear well, if he wants to talk about the shutdown.
I want to be there once.
FISA bill with the interim spending bill, separate disaster funding. Yes, it's actually all. Yeah. Thank you. All right.
Wow. Yeah.
Nobody's more wise up. Come on. We're never going to wise up to anything. But no, I just got a small Sony. Tiny. DSL. Yes. Yeah. It's almost a pocket. I've got any ID on it. It's not the A7. It's almost a professional system. So I think one step over $900, something like that. And it takes very nice charts. I'd like to compliment our staffs. Okay, good afternoon, everybody, and thank you for joining us today. Now, we know they're popping champagne down Pennsylvania Avenue.
there are only two places where America is popping champagne: the White House and the corporate boardrooms, including Trump Tower. Otherwise, Americans have a lot to regret. First, I want to respond to some comments that Senator McConnell made on the Senate floor this morning. His opening comments. First, he said, I brought them along because they are so good to use. This is McConnell's transcript. Now, here's what he said. First, he said, the Senate accomplished something really remarkable. He's right. To pass a bill of tax cuts and have it be so unpopular with the American people is an amazing achievement for the Republicans. It's never been done before. To have, for the first time, according to Wall Street Journal poll, Americans prefer Democrats to Republicans on taxes, it's truly remarkable. Great accomplishment, Mitch. Great accomplishment, Republicans. Now, second, he said he championed the open process the tax bill went through. Sure, they went through an open process. Only if you define open by one party negotiating behind closed doors, having one markup with only one expert witness, while voting down every single amendment proposed by Democrats. If anyone believes that this was an open process, then I have a bridge back in my hometown to sell you. Then Senator McConnell told us this bill was passed to encourage job creation and put more money in the pockets of working men and women. Well, if you believe trickle-down economics, he's right. The trouble is no one in America, not the American public, not the economists, believe that trickle-down works. Corporations are flush with cash right now. The stock market's booming. Job creation isn't. Look at all the companies that have already said they're going to use their tax break for stock buybacks, for dividends that don't affect average Americans. And I love the example of AT&T. Over the last 10 years, AT&T has paid an average tax rate of 8% a year. They have 80,000 fewer employees today than they had then. Tax breaks don't lead to job creation. They lead to big CEO salaries and money for the very, very wealthy. And finally, Senator McConnell touted the repeal of the individual mandate. That's true. And now our Republican friends will own premium increases on millions of middle-class families. To many of them, the increase they're going to have to pay in health insurance far exceeds the amount of a tax break that they will get. And 13 million fewer Americans will have health insurance at all. So, as Republicans head to the White House for their backslapping and high fives to celebrate passage of a bill against the will of the American people, we have a simple message for our Republican friends. Republicans will rue the day they pass this bill, and you can bet Democrats will make sure of that. We are going to continue to hammer away at why this bill is so unpopular, at why what the Republican rhetoric and the reality is so far apart. Today's passage of the partisan tax bill officially cements the Republican Party as the party of the wealthy and the party of big corporations against the middle class and the working people of this country. Why? President Trump, his rich fans, cabinet members and donors, and the biggest corporations make out like bandits while the middle class gets crumbs and tax hikes. Corporations get permanent tax breaks. Individual tax breaks expire. By 2027, according to the Joint Committee on Taxation, 83% of the middle class, almost 145 million American families, will either get a tax increase or see a tax change of less than $100. Meanwhile, according to the Tax Policy Center, the top 1% of earners reap 83% of the benefits. Let me say that again. Middle class, 83% get an increase of taxes or a decrease of less than $100. top 1%, 83% of the benefits. So, it's no surprise when President Trump admitted this morning that the corporate rate was the biggest factor in their plan. Middle-class America's asking, they're scratching their heads. Why does the top get far more than I do? Why do I get a tax increase when so many of them get a huge decrease? This bill doesn't sit well with the American people right now, and it will not sit well with the American people next year. So when middle-class families see their taxes go up, they'll know Republicans are to blame. When middle-class families see their health premiums rise, they'll know Republicans are to blame. And when middle-class families see billions more in stock buybacks and dividends going to wealthy shareholders instead of increased wages or new jobs, they'll know Republicans are to blame. So, while Republicans will own every nook and cranny of this awful tax bill, Democrats are going to fight like hell to stop Speaker Ryan and the Freedom Caucus from ending Medicare and cutting Medicaid. Leader Pelosi.
Thank you very much, Mr. Leader. I associate myself with the Leader's remarks in the interest of time. When he talked about champagne bottles being opened in the executive suites and in the White House, I will add to that that Joe Sixpack is paying the price in a very severe way. Today, the House Republicans are cheering. They're toasting the fact that they raised taxes on 86 million American families, middle-class families. Remember these three numbers. 86 million middle-class families get a tax increase. 83% of the tax advantage goes to the top 1%. 13 million Americans may lose health insurance as their premiums go up under elimination of the individual mandate. This is what they are drinking toast to. Now the Republicans are taking their cool victory lap, toasting it with champagne with their donors and the wealthiest. But they didn't do what they promised. Think of this. In the campaign, the president said that he would end carried interest loophole. Instead, maybe he didn't communicate this to the Republicans in Congress, or maybe they just used him as their front man, but they didn't do that. Instead, they did not end carried interest loophole. They protected and even added more loopholes for the richest. Secretary Mnuchin promised the GOP would not cut taxes for the rich. And then they handed the wealthiest 1%, 83% of the benefits in this tax proposal. The GOP said this bill was, the president promised the middle class would benefit when he was on the campaign trail. And, of course, it raises taxes again on 86 million middle-class American families. The GOP said it would pay for itself. It would pay for itself. Instead, it will explode the national debt. And on that score, when Speaker Ryan was asked this morning, while Mitch was in the wee small hours, or maybe this, he said, I don't know what he said, but it was this morning, either early or later this morning. And he was saying that the Speaker was on the Today Show, and when they asked him if the tax bill would create enough growth to not add to the deficit, the Speaker said, nobody knows the answer to that. Well, we know the answer to that. It will not. And don't take it just from us. We've always known, every credible analysis from every expert in or out of government, Republican and Democrats say Republicans are exploding the debt with their giveaways to the wealthy. As Bruce Bartlett, who helped create the Republican tax trickle down with Jack Kemp, said, anyone who says this, it's not true, it's nonsense. Should I say what he said?
Yes.
It's BS. But he said full thing. And the Republicans know it. Republicans only care about the deficit. You know, whatever happened, I say it over and over, the poor deficit hawk, it's become, if not an endangered species, extinct. Because the Republicans only seem to care about the deficit when it comes time to invest in people, not when it comes time to give giveaways to corporate America and to the wealthiest. That's okay. But the sad fact is, investing in people, the education of our children, nothing brings more to the Treasury than investing in early childhood, K through 12, higher education, postgrad, lifetime learning for our workers. Nothing brings more money to the Treasury, reduces the deficit, than investing in education. But that always has to be offset where permanent tax cuts for corporate America to the tune of over $1 trillion, which will add to more in terms of interest on the debt. That does not have to be offset or paid for. So again, if it's corporate America, you have a free ride. If it's investing in our children, you have to pay for it, and look at CHIP being one example of that. So as their tax scam explodes the deficit, the Republicans will tell seniors, oh, now we have this big deficit. We're going to have to say to disabled children, to working families, to our seniors, we can't afford Medicare and Medicaid. And in fact, they said this week we may have to raise the age to be eligible for Social Security. Now, Republicans are noting, again, we have a better path. What we would hope to do as we go forward is to make the case to the American people that we should be working in a bipartisan way to create growth that generates good-paying jobs that does reduce the deficit. That's the comparison between us. In fact, when Speaker Boehner was Speaker, and this all came up during the Bush years and the rest, and he wasn't Speaker then, but he referenced it as Speaker, where they said trickle-down economics is the policy that they were advocating, and if it create jobs, that would be good. But if it doesn't, so be it. That's the free market. The free market. These guys have their hand in Uncle Sam's pocket every step of the way, but it's the free market when it comes to anything else. The American people saw right through this brazen con job Republicans tried to sell them. Even the simplicity of it, they were going to reduce the brackets. They did not. They were 7. They said it would be 4. It's 7. They said you could return your taxes on a postcard. Really? Maybe the size of this postcard, I don't know, but I don't know how you get that through the mail. American people saw that the Republican tax scam was not working for America's working families. The foundation has been laid on this message. The GOP tax scam is about bleeding the middle class dry to pad the pockets of corporate America and the wealthiest 1%. I'm pointing to the sign, Mr. Leader.
Because I am certainly not in that category.
The insulting crumbs they give working families are meager and temporary. The tax breaks for corporate America are vast and permanent. After all the president's promises, I'm just thinking, I think, did he get conned by the Republicans in Congress? Because they have not kept his promises
Willingly.
to the American
Willingly
people.
conned.
Willingly conned.
Yep.
He's responsible for his actions, no question. But they did not honor his promises to the American people. Well, maybe that was the con. Who knows? After all the president's promises, after all Republicans brazenly transparent misrepresentations to the American people, the true face of what Republicans stand for has been revealed. Instead of focusing on the middle class, which contains millions of our veterans, on the forgotten Americans, Republicans have voted to install a permanent plutocracy in our country. That does violence to the vision of our founders, violence to the vision of what they sacrificed so much for. Thank you.
Questions first on this subject.
On the subject of promises, actually, one of the big Republican promises was that they were going to sweep corporate loopholes out of the tax code. How did they do on that front?
Every day we're finding more corporate loopholes that were put in this bill, and that will continue over the next month or two. When you do a bill in the dark, it gives a great opportunity for lobbyists to do their handiwork and give huge breaks to specific corporations and others. The corporate loopholes are worse than ever in this bill.
So they didn't simplify.
It's more complicated today than it was before they started. It's more regressive today than before they started. It's more unfair today than before when they started.
And by the way, these are tax expenditures. That is spending the taxpayers' money to give a corporate, and of course, they're not paid for.
One of the consequences of the bill is that they talk
keep the government open if they put that in there. Seems like you guys
Look, it's their responsibility. They haven't shown us any plan for how they're going to get it done. So let's wait till they come to us and tell us how they expect to get it done.
But would you be willing to eat that?
Let's wait till they come to us and see what their plan is for getting it done.
Do you think Leader McConnell misled Senator Collins in promising that they could pass the health stabilization bills in order to win their support?
Well, it's unclear what they said to one another, but it's clear one thing, that Leader McConnell and all the Republicans have made the health care system much worse. 13 million people not covered, premiums going up by 10%, and no one believes that the two bills that Senator Collins wants added to this, which now they've said they're delaying till January, but no one believes that those two bills would make up for the detritus, for the destruction that is caused by removing the mandate. And they're going to pay a price for that, big time. They talk about, again, the increase in premiums for so many Americans will far outweigh any tax decrease they get.
And those increases are wholly owned by the Republican Party. When you take the individual mandate and reduce by 13 million people, perhaps that many, from the pool, you're increasing cost. The bigger the pool, the lower the price, the healthier the country.
One other thing, and Patty Murray has said this, Alexander Murray was not designed for a system where the mandate was removed. So it doesn't work anymore. So it's an empty promise, even whether it's in a bill or out of a bill. Yes.
They're talking about technical corrections bills on this, extenders. You've warned that there'll be loopholes near that start hemorrhaging revenue. How much and how did Democrats engage on subsequent tax bills in 2018?
Well, again, we think this bill is so bad that it's very hard to fix in small little tweaks. We'll see what they propose, but our view, we're going to hammer away at this. This is going to be an issue for us all year. This is not just forgotten. The fact they say, oh, once people learn of what this is in this bill, they'll all be for it. Well, the Koch brothers have already spent tens of millions of dollars trying to persuade people this is a good bill. And the majority of Americans, by most polls, think it's a bad bill. And the reason is very simple. The suspicions of the American people that the Republican Party is helping the wealthy and the powerful corporations and not the middle class has been confirmed in this bill.
And just to say, they did a massive bill that has trillions of dollars of impact on the economy without a single hearing, with only the person from the Joint Tax Committee responding to questions at the markup, with accepting no amendments. And now all of a sudden, they have this massive bill that they've done the speed of light in the dark of night. They think that we're going to, that they're going to tweak this into something better. It's just, we have to go to comprehensive tax reform in a bipartisan way, create growth, generate good paying jobs, reduce the deficit. If they don't have those goals, you wouldn't end up, if they had those goals, you wouldn't end up with this.
We had some bipartisan talks going in the Senate with Republicans and Democrats, and the Republican leadership pulled the Republicans out. We could have had a much better bill done in a bipartisan way that would have been permanent, would have done much more for the middle class, and done much more to reduce the deficit.
But that's not what they were about. They weren't about the middle class. In their DNA, the Republicans are about tax cuts for the wealthy and for corporate America. They're for trickle down. They're not for bubble up from the middle class.
The Republicans repeatedly said, look, the proof will be in the paycheck. Next year you're going to see, more money that you can spend on your own. What can you point to as Democrats to say this tax plan isn't so good?
Well, first, a whole lot of people are going to get tax increases. And second, the average American says, even if I get a $100 tax decrease, why is a wealthy person getting a $50,000 tax decrease? The decrease should go to the middle class and people trying to get there, not to wealthy people, and that's why the bill is so unpopular. They know what this bill is all about. They know they're getting crumbs, if that, while the wealthy are getting big pieces of cake. And that's why it's so unpopular.
But I thought the tax policy center said 80% would see some kind of tax cut.
Well, the tax policy center said some would get a tax cut, but it's small, it vanishes, and the wealthy get a much bigger break. That's what the American polling data, very interesting. The world has changed since the time even of George W. Bush's tax cuts. When people asked, if you get a small tax break and the wealthy get a big tax break, do you want it or not? Overwhelmingly, the people say no.
Senator, on different topic.
No. Well,
No,
okay.
so
Any
we're
more on
finished
this
with
one? Then we'll go to your topics.
Senator,
Yes, 1, 2.
on the child tax credit, could you talk about the Democratic decision not to support the Rubio-Lee amendment? Was it a missed opportunity, and what's the path forward?
The Rubio-Lee amendment was hardly anything.
That's right.
We had a much better proposal. They missed the opportunity by not supporting in our House the Brown-Bennett proposal, which would have really done something. You know, so many of our Republican colleagues knew this was a bad bill, so they tried to tweak it to make it a tiny little bit better. That's not going to solve the problem at all.
And in that regard, one of the champions of child tax credit in our House, Congresswoman Rosa DeLauro, who has devoted her life to addressing the needs of children in America, the child tax credit was something she eagerly awaited. It's important to note this. If you make $400,000 a year, you get a $4,000 child tax credit. Family of four, $400,000 a year. If you're a single mom with 2 children making $14,000 a year, how much do you think you get? $75. $75. It's a fraud.
The child tax credit that they did mirrors what they've done in the bill. The wealthier you are, the better you did.
Yeah. And not just by amount of money, by percentage.
On your point that Democrats are going to keep hammering this going forward, and you alluded to this, that the president himself stands to do very well under this bill.
Yes.
Is that going to be a central part of the Democrats' message?
The president does very well under this bill. Most of his cabinet does very well under this bill. Large percentage of his contributors do very well under this bill. Yes, the president is part of the top 1%, and the bill is aimed to help the top 1%. So the president's part and parcel to the problem.
But our focus in the campaign will also be on what this means to people in their individual lives. Financial insecurity, financial instability is a major concern, apprehension for the American people, and we have to show them there is a better way. We have a better deal, better jobs, better pay, better future, and that's part of the debate that we will have. So that, yes, they get all of that at the exploitation of the worker, and on top of it all, which is really kind of very sad, is they try to represent that it's about the middle class. Let me go back to Mnuchin. I just think his statement is just so Mnuchin. I mean, what are we talking about? Billionaires here.
He just seems to, Mnuchin seems to make it up as he goes along.
GOP won't cut taxes for the rich.
Yeah.
They handed the top wealthiest 1%, 83% of the benefits. So that's one part of it. But what does it mean to you in your life? You're going to lose some of your deductions, whether it's on your mortgage or state taxes. The SALT will hurt people enormously. And the services they receive from their state and local governments. It is also about they're going to lose access to quality, affordable health care as well. The list goes on and on. So it's really more about our constituents, yes, making the contrast, but focusing on what it means to them.
And one place we're really going to focus on is the suburbs. This is a horrible bill for so many suburban people.
And they know it.
And they know it. And the suburbs are now, I think, going to move much bluer because of this tax bill.
Senator, on year-end spending, will you allow Congress to adjourn or leave town without a chip deal?
Look, we're trying to get as good a deal as possible. We're not going to negotiate against ourselves right here. But the bottom line is we haven't even seen anything. They're so busy with the tax proposal that we haven't even seen a proposal. Leader Pelosi can talk about the House, but we haven't seen a thing from Senate Republicans yet. So we have to see what they propose. The bottom line is there are things they want, there are things we want. If they sit down and negotiate with us, which they haven't done yet, we could come to a good agreement. If they're just going to put in the things they want and not the things we want, it's going to lead to a real problem.
The Children's Health Insurance Program serves 9 million children in our country. Its authorization ended on September 30th, the end of the fiscal year. For 3 months, nearly, 2.5, how many months is that? We have had this vacuum where states are losing funds, are running out of funds to meet the needs. And what do the Republicans do? They had sent a bill to the floor called the Walden Bill. And how they pay, because you have to pay for children's health, you don't have to pay for corporate America, but you have to pay for children's health. How do they pay for it? What offsets do they use? Other children's health. In order to pay for the CHIP program, they'll take money out of the prevention fund, which is about inoculations for children. It's about addressing lead poisoning regard to children and other issues that relate to children's health. So they're saying to children, we'll pass children's health insurance program, but you're going to pay for it out of another a broader children's account. That's totally unacceptable. That's the bill they sent to the floor. That's the bill we voted against. That is the same bill that they say they're going to put in the CR.
And by the way, why did they wait so long? Children's Health has been in trouble since September. On issue after issue, they've been so busy giving tax breaks to the wealthy that they've neglected so many issues, including CHIP, including FISA, including issues very important to America. They're derelict in their duties, and now they're scrambling at the last minute. One more. Go ahead.
My questions are on defense anomalies. The House is considering taking up a bill that would boost some defense spending. I know you talked about omnibus to just boost defense not flying, but if it's less money.
No. From what we've been told, at least the previous anomalies are ways just of getting around the defense cap, and we will not accept that one way or the other. They should. We have said all along there's got to be parity. Defense goes up, spending for average families goes up in terms of health care, in terms of education, in terms of infrastructure, veterans, opioids, pensions. We're sticking with that. We're not letting them try to get around this one way or the other. Thank you, everybody.
Bye-bye.